She gave up her pride for one night, but what she gained was something no one could put a price on. Eleanor Hayes was a devoted single mother, a quiet woman who kept her head down and did her job with grace. Until one morning, she found herself drowning in $280,000 of debt, a debt she didn't create. Betrayed by someone she once trusted, facing her mother's medical bills and the possibility of losing everything, Eleanor was cornered. Then came an offer from a man she barely knew, the CEO of the company. He would pay everything for one night with her. Now, ask yourself, if you had no way out, if your child's future, your mother's health, and your entire life were hanging by a thread, would you say yes? This is not a story of scandal. It's a story of quiet courage, unexpected healing, and a kind of love that grows not in passion, but in trust. Stay with us. And if this story touches something in you, leave a comment, subscribe, or share it with someone who needs it. Now, let's begin. What do you do when everything you've built starts crumbling? And it's not even your fault, Eleanor Hayes found out on a quiet Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that should have passed without consequence. The kind where the coffee is just warm enough. The sunlight hits the kitchen counter at the perfect angle. And the house, though modest, breathes a soft kind of peace. But peace, like good china, is fragile. And that morning, it shattered. Eleanor was 42, a woman of quiet strength and practiced grace. She had been the executive secretary at Wexley and Hart Construction for over 14 years, a cornerstone kind of employee, reliable, discreet, efficient, the kind of woman who sent thank you notes by hand, kept extra granola bars in her desk drawer for interns who skipped lunch, and remembered every birthday in the office without ever needing to look it up. But none of that mattered when the envelope arrived. It wasn't from a court, not yet. It was a thick manila packet with her name printed in black, sealed with silence and consequence. She opened it while standing in the kitchen, the smell of eggs still lingering in the air, her mother humming a hymn softly in the next room, and her teenage daughter, Lily, already gone for school. Inside the packet were pages, cold, official, and sharp with implication. A debt, $280,000, signed in her name, authorized with her social security number, traced to a business venture she'd never heard of because it hadn't been hers. At first, she thought it was a mistake, some cruel phishing attempt or identity theft. But as she flipped page after page, her breath catching in her throat, she saw the familiar handwriting at the bottom of a document. The signature was forged, but the forger was someone she had once trusted with her house keys. Claire Dawson, best friend since college, maid of honor at her wedding, godmother to Lily. Claire had asked for help last year, a loan application, just something to smooth over a short-term investment issue. She'd said Eleanor, ever cautious, had refused. But she hadn't realized Claire had already filed under Eleanor's name weeks before the conversation even happened. And now, Claire was gone. Vanished, disconnected phone, closed social media, the money gone too. Eleanor sat at the small oak kitchen table for a long time, the same table her father had built by hand before he passed. She traced a crack in the wood with her fingertip, trying to breathe past the wave of nausea that rose in her chest. Her mother, Margaret, walked in slowly with her walker. "Ellie, you look pale, honey." "Did the coffee turn bad?" Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile women wear when they don't want to worry the people they love. "No, Mama, it's just a long morning." She couldn't tell her. Not yet. Her mother's heart was fragile now, literally. The latest round of medical bills had already stretched them too thin. And Eleanor had worked so hard to keep Lily from worrying. That girl had enough on her shoulders already navigating college applications, a part-time job, and the complicated grief of losing her father to a highway accident 6 years ago. There was no room for Eleanor to fall apart. So, she stood, poured another cup of coffee, and took the papers upstairs. The next 2 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and hushed phone calls to legal aid clinics. No one could move fast enough. The loan company wanted repayment or asset seizure. The bank account she shared with her mother was frozen pending investigation. Lily's college savings gone. And then, the call from HR. Eleanor, we need you to come in early tomorrow. There's been a discrepancy with one of the operating accounts. Of course there had been. The forged documents included references to a business under her name, one that had, somehow, been tied to a contractor account at Wexley and Hart. The implications were serious. Internal fraud, misuse of company funds, breach of contract. She dressed carefully that morning, gray slacks, soft lavender blouse, flats instead of heels. Not because she wanted to look sharp, but because the weight in her chest made her too tired for anything else. When she arrived at the office, it felt different, too quiet, too clean. People avoided her gaze in the hallway. Some smiled too politely, others not at all. She sat across from two people in suits she'd known for years, men who had shared cupcakes with her in the break room, laughed at office jokes, called her the heart of this place. And now they were reading from a file folder, as if she were a stranger. Words like due diligence and audit flags swirled through the air. No one asked her how she was. No one asked what happened. They just asked her to explain. She did, as best she could. Her voice stayed steady, even when her hands shook under the table. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. When it was done, they handed her a paper to sign a statement of understanding. Not a firing, not yet, just pending. The word itself hung in her mind like a fog. She left the conference room with her spine straight but her stomach twisted. That afternoon, while sorting through archived contracts on her computer, she received a message through the company intranet. Please report to the executive floor. Mr. Whitmore has requested to see you. She stared at the screen, blinking. She had worked under the umbrella of Grayson Whitmore's company for over a decade, but she had never once been in a room with him. He was a name, a signature, a presence in quarterly newsletters, rumored to be brilliant, reclusive, calculating. He wasn't the kind of man who called in secretaries, unless it was bad, unless this really was the end. She closed the file on her screen, took a slow breath, and stood. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Eleanor wondered how much more could possibly unravel before she simply disappeared with it. She thought it would be a formal warning, a signature on a termination letter, a quiet walk to the parking lot with a cardboard box of her things. Instead, it became a turning point she never saw coming. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, except for the soft hum of the motor and Eleanor's own breathing steady but shallow. She had always avoided this floor, like most employees did. It wasn't a place for people like her. It belonged to men in sharp suits and women in tailored blazers who talked about stock options and golf memberships. Not single mothers with calloused hands and second-hand blouses. When the elevator opened, a sharply dressed assistant stood waiting. Ms. Hayes. Eleanor nodded, her voice caught somewhere in her chest. This way, please. The hallway was lined with abstract art and polished floors that clicked softly beneath her shoes. At the end stood a set of double doors, tall, dark wood, slightly intimidating. The assistant opened them without knocking. Inside was a room that didn't feel like an office. It felt like a sanctuary of quiet power, muted grays, deep browns, sunlight pouring through tall windows. And at the far end, standing behind a minimalist desk, was Grayson Whitmore. He was taller than she imagined, not imposing but precise. Everything about him looked expensive, understated, and unapproachable. Salt and pepper hair, dark suit, pale blue shirt with no tie. He glanced up when she entered, setting aside a folder. Ms. Hayes, thank you for coming. Eleanor offered a nod, unsure what to say. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, back straight like she was waiting to be judged. Grayson gestured to the chair across from him. Please, have a seat. She sat, barely letting herself touch the backrest. Her palms were damp, and the air felt thinner than it should have. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her with eyes that didn't seem cold, but measured, as if she were a riddle he intended to solve. I've read through the situation, he said at last. Your friend Claire Dawson, the forged documents, the personal loan, the pending investigations. Eleanor flinched slightly at the name, but nodded. Also, he continued, the medical bills for your mother, the frozen account, and your daughter's college plans. She blinked. How much did he know? His tone softened just slightly. I make it a point to understand the lives of people who work for me, even if I don't always show it. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. This was worse than she thought. He knew everything. She braced for the next sentence, whatever version of you're no longer needed it would be. But what came instead was something she couldn't have predicted. I'd like to make you an offer, he said, one that could clear your debt, protect your family, give you breathing room. She frowned. What kind of offer? He didn't hesitate. I'll pay off everything, the loan, the medical bills. I'll even reinstate your salary under a special consultancy agreement if you agree to spend one night with me. The words landed like stones in her stomach. Silence filled the room. Not awkward silence, but heavy, like the kind that follows bad news or an unexpected storm. Eleanor blinked. Sure, she had misheard. I'm sorry. What one night? He repeated, his voice calm, almost clinical. Here, with me, no obligations afterward, just one night. She stood up, hands trembling. Is this some kind of twisted joke? No, he said plainly. It's a proposal. One I understand may sound indecent, but I believe in transactions with clear terms. You need help. I have the means to provide it. Her chest tightened. You're offering to buy me. He didn't flinch. I'm offering you a solution. You still have a choice. She stared at him. This wasn't a man trying to seduce. There was no charm, no manipulation, just raw, blunt logic. She hated him for that, and hated herself even more for not walking out immediately. But she didn't. She left slowly, silent, eyes burning with shame and rage. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed while her mother slept in the next room. Her breathing labored but steady. She thought of Lily, curled in her blankets down the hall, dreaming of a future that might not come. She thought of the house, the bills, the locked accounts, and she thought of Claire, her name now, a bruise that wouldn't fade. At 3 a.m., she went into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands trembled, her eyes were dry, but her heart ached in places she didn't have words for. What would one night cost her, more than she wanted to admit? But what would losing everything cost her daughter? She returned to her room, pulled out an old shoebox, and stared at a faded photograph of her husband, his laugh frozen in time. She whispered, I'm sorry, and it was the first time she allowed herself to cry. The next evening, Eleanor returned to the same elevator. This time, she didn't wear flats. She wore her late husband's favorite navy dress and a coat she hadn't worn in years, not because she wanted to be beautiful, but because she wanted to feel like someone who hadn't yet broken. Grayson greeted her at the door. No smile, no arrogance, just a nod. The evening passed in silence. No candlelight, no music, just quiet acknowledgement of the decision they had both made. And when it was over, Eleanor lay awake in the guest bedroom, eyes open in the dark. She felt no victory, no relief, only an ache she couldn't explain, and a hollow space where certainty used to live. In the morning, she stood in the kitchen making tea. The windows let in soft light. Grayson entered without a word. He looked rested, composed. She waited for a farewell, or a thank you, or a transaction receipt. Instead, he said quietly, I don't want just one night. I want you to stay. Most people return to their lives after a mistake. They try to move on, bury the memory under errands, bills, and everyday noise. Eleanor was offered something else, a weekend in the mountains. It came the next morning as she sat on the edge of Grayson's guest bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. He stood near the window, back to her, speaking with that same calm neutrality she had come to both resent and rely on. There's a house I keep in the Blue Ridge, he said, quiet, secluded. It might help you think. About what she asked, her voice tired. About what you want, he said. Then after a pause, about what comes next for you. It wasn't a command. There was no trace of manipulation or guilt, just a door being opened. She said yes, not because she trusted him, but because she didn't trust herself. She didn't know who she was anymore, not really. And the idea of disappearing, even for a few days, held the strange pull of a lighthouse seen from a sinking ship. The drive to the mountains took nearly 4 hours. Eleanor watched the world shift outside the window, from city glass and concrete to winding roads and whispering trees. Autumn had begun to lay its colors across the hillsides. The red maples and golden oaks blurred past like brushstrokes. Grayson didn't speak much, which suited her fine. There was nothing to say that wouldn't bruise the silence. When they arrived, the cabin was more than she expected. Not grand, not cold. It was all weathered wood and wide porches, a place that smelled of pine and earth. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fireplace with a stone hearth that looked like it had stories of its own. He gave her space, unpacked groceries, stacked firewood, and then quietly disappeared into the study. Eleanor wandered through the rooms, fingers trailing over old books, sun-warmed windowsills, a jar of dried lavender by the sink. Everything here felt untouched by urgency. She slept most of that first afternoon, lulled by stillness. And for the first time in weeks, she dreamed of nothing. By the second day, Eleanor began to breathe differently. Not fully, not yet, but enough to notice the ache in her chest had dulled. She walked each morning, long, quiet strolls down mossy paths that curved like questions waiting for answers. Sometimes she found wildflowers. Sometimes she found only silence. Both felt like gifts. She cooked simple meals, vegetable soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, scrambled eggs with rosemary. Grayson accepted her offerings without comment, always cleaning his plate, always setting his fork down with quiet precision. Their conversations were minimal, often no more than "good morning," "dinner's ready," "would you like tea?" But underneath the quiet, something else stirred, a kind of awareness that made the air hum like a violin string just touched. Eleanor watched him when he wasn't looking, the way he rubbed his temple when deep in thought, how he stood too long at the window some evenings, as if waiting for someone who never came. And Grayson. He never said it aloud, but he noticed the way she folded napkins with perfect symmetry, how she hummed when she chopped vegetables, the way her eyes searched every room before she entered, as if still bracing for something to fall apart. The storm arrived on the 3rd night. It crept in slowly, gray clouds swallowing the sun, then quickened. Thunder rolled low through the hills. Rain pelted the windows with a rhythm that matched Eleanor's pulse. She lit candles as the power flickered once, twice, then vanished completely. Grayson emerged from the study, holding a flashlight and 2 blankets. "We'll lose heat soon," he said. "The fireplace is our best bet." They layered quilts near the hearth and settled on the floor, facing the flames. Dinner had been simple leftover soup reheated on the gas stovetop, and now, with only candlelight and fire to warm them, the night slowed to a hush. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The fire cracked softly, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Eleanor sipped warm cider from a mug and stared into the flames. "You come here often?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He nodded. "When I need quiet, or when I forget how to be around people." She looked at him, then really looked. He wasn't wearing the armor of tailored suits and sterile offices. Just a plain sweater, jeans, and a look in his eyes that didn't quite match the man she'd met days ago. "I never thought silence could be a kindness," she said. "It is," he replied. "Most people just don't know how to sit in it. They let the silence grow between them again. This time, like a bridge rather than a wall." Eleanor leaned her head back against the arm of the couch. She was tired, but not the same kind of tired that had followed her from Charleston. This tired felt cleaner, like something that could be healed with time, not just endured. Grayson shifted slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. His gaze was distant, but not cold. "I didn't expect you to say yes," he murmured. She didn't answer, because the truth was, neither did she. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire whispered. And in that moment, sitting a few feet apart, wrapped in quilts and questions, something between them shifted, not loudly, not obviously, but like the first crack of ice before a spring thaw. They looked at each other, and though no words passed between them, the silence was no longer empty. It was becoming familiar. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up with soup on a cold day. That's how it began with soup. The morning after the storm, the air outside the cabin had turned sharp and white. Snow blanketed the porch railings, clung to the pine branches, softened the world into something still and soundless. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, ladling chicken broth into a pot. Her hands moved on instinct: chop, stir, taste. It was the same recipe she had made 100 times for her daughter when she was sick. Simple, nourishing, a kind of unspoken care. Grayson came in quietly, brushing snow from his sleeves. He had been outside since dawn, clearing a path around the cabin, splitting logs for the fire. He didn't speak. Just placed a mug of tea beside her on the counter, steam rising between them. She nodded. He nodded back. No thank yous, no small talk, just two people learning the rhythm of being near each other without needing to fill the space. They fell into that rhythm over the next few days, not deliberately. It happened the way moss grows over stone, slow and unnoticed, until one day, it's simply there. Eleanor began cooking more. Omelets in the morning, stews that simmered all afternoon, warm banana bread, the scent of cinnamon curling up the staircase. She didn't ask if he liked it, he didn't say, but he always finished every bite. Grayson, in turn, began doing small things. He brought in firewood before she asked. He swept the porch each morning, even as the snow returned overnight. He fixed a loose cabinet hinge. He placed a small vase of pine branches on the table one evening, without explanation. And when she sat down to eat, the table was already set. It was strange, Eleanor thought, how the quiet things could feel louder than words. One night, they sat on the couch, each with a book in hand. The fire had faded to a low glow. Outside, the snow fell in thick, lazy flakes. Eleanor wasn't reading. Her eyes were on the photograph sitting on the nearby shelf. It was a black and white portrait of a woman, mid-30s maybe, dark curls, soft eyes, a certain fragility around the mouth. Next to it, a stack of watercolor paintings leaned carefully against the wall. Grayson noticed her gaze. He hesitated, then said, "My mother painted those." The photo was taken just after she finished her last piece. She was talented, Eleanor said, setting her book aside. He gave a slow nod. She was quiet, like this house, like snow. You didn't always notice her. Until she wasn't there anymore. Eleanor's voice dropped. What happened? She battled depression most of her life, Grayson said, barely above a whisper. She hid it well. Smiled for photos, kept the house immaculate. But inside, he trailed off, looking at the fire. She took her life the winter I turned 24. The room seemed to hold its breath. I'm sorry, Eleanor said softly, unsure if those two words were enough. They're not, he replied, but they're kind. He didn't say more, and she didn't press. But later that night, when she made him a cup of tea, she placed it beside him with both hands and lingered a second longer. He noticed. That evening, Eleanor opened her sketchbook for the first time in years. She had once drawn as a way to calm her thoughts. Tiny sketches of rooftops, coffee cups, her daughter's shoes. But life had become too loud for art, too demanding, too survival-focused. Now, in the hush of the cabin, the pencil felt familiar in her hand again. She sat at the kitchen table, sketching the view from the window-bare trees, low hills, the path Grayson had carved through the snow. When he passed by, he stopped. He didn't say anything, just looked at the sketch, then looked at her. I didn't know you drew, he said after a pause. I didn't know I still could, she replied. A smile small, but real touched the corner of his mouth. Later, as they cleaned up from dinner, Eleanor shared something unexpected. She reached for her phone and scrolled to a picture of her daughter, Anna, from 2 years ago, wearing a paper crown, frosting on her cheek, arms wrapped tight around a puppy. She's 16 now, Eleanor said, but this was her last birthday before everything fell apart. Grayson studied the photo with quiet interest. She looks like you, fierce and kind. Eleanor blinked. She hadn't heard that in so long. Her father left when she was 2. She said, I think sometimes she wonders if she was hard to love. Grayson didn't respond right away. Then he said, people who are hard to love often just need someone who stays. She looked at him then. And for a moment, everything that had been unspoken between them felt very near. The snow continued through the night. The fire popped gently. Grayson sat on the floor, fixing a hinge on the cabinet again. Eleanor dried dishes, humming a song from her childhood. And then, as if he hadn't meant to say it aloud, Grayson said quietly, you make this place feel less empty. Eleanor turned to look at him. He didn't meet her eyes. He just kept working. But the words hung in the air between them, gentle and heavy. Not a confession. Not yet. But maybe the first echo of something deeper. The more comfortable something feels, the more terrifying it is to lose. Eleanor had known many kinds of discomfort in her life. Tight budgets, cold shoulders, sleepless nights, and long commutes. But comfort, that was newer. And, strangely, it unnerved her. Each morning in the cabin had begun to feel a little too soft. The warmth of the fire, the low murmur of Grayson's footsteps upstairs, the scent of cinnamon and pine in the air. The silence had gone from unfamiliar to intimate, and that scared her more than anything else. Because comfort leads to wanting, and wanting leads to hope, and Eleanor had learned, far too well, that hope can be a cruel thing when the ground beneath you is always shifting. So, she made a plan. She folded it neatly in her mind, like a well-packed suitcase. She would leave on Monday, thank Grayson for his kindness, return to Charleston, find work, any work, and rebuild the life she had put on pause. No strings, no confusion, just clean lines and distance. That Sunday morning, she found Grayson in the kitchen pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He looked at her with the smallest hint of a smile, one she'd come to recognize as his version of warmth. She took the mug, held it in both hands, then said, gently but firmly, I'm going back tomorrow. He didn't speak right away, just set his cup down with care. The quiet between them stretched long, taut. You don't have to, he said finally. I know. You're not obligated to anything anymore. Eleanor, that agreement, it's over. You know that. I do. I'm not asking as someone who helped you, he said, voice lower now. I'm asking as someone who wants you to stay, just as you are, just because you're here. Her throat tightened. He continued, you don't owe me anything, but this place, it's better with you in it. She looked away, blinking hard. I can't stay. Grayson, not like this. I'm starting to forget where the edges are, and I need edges. I need to feel where I end and the world begins. He nodded slowly, didn't argue, didn't plead. He just said, if you ever want to come back, the door won't be locked. That nearly undid her, but she held herself together. Barely. That evening, Eleanor cooked one last meal, roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed sweet potatoes, and steamed green beans with lemon zest. She moved slowly through the kitchen, memorizing the feel of every handle, every drawer, every creak in the floorboard beneath the sink. Grayson offered to help, but she shook her head. Let me do this, she said. Just let me give you something ordinary. They ate in silence, as they often did. But there was a heaviness in the air this time, like unspoken things pressing against the walls. After dinner, Eleanor stayed up alone in the kitchen. She opened her sketchbook one last time. The page she chose was thick and cream-colored, and it took the pencil softly. She drew the kitchen as it looked at that very moment. The candle on the table still flickering, 2 mugs in the sink, the faint glow of firelight from the next room. It wasn't a perfect drawing, but it was honest. In the corner of the sketch, she wrote, "Some lights are worth returning for." She tore the page carefully, folded it once, and left it under Grayson's book on the coffee table. She rose early the next morning, too early for goodbyes. Her suitcase was already packed, light and practical. She stood at the door for a long moment, hand on the knob. Behind her, the cabin was quiet, still asleep. She didn't write a note, didn't leave instructions, just walked out into the cold dawn. As the gravel crunched beneath her boots, she felt the ache rise in her chest, slow, but steady. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd left in that house. How many pieces of her had quietly taken root between the bookshelves, under the soft lamplight, between every unspoken moment. But she walked anyway, because sometimes choosing yourself means walking away from something good. Not because you don't want it, but because you're not ready to receive it. Back in Charleston, the city felt noisier than she remembered. The buses hissed along King Street, the sidewalks were crowded, and the air was thicker both in temperature and tension. She returned to the house she shared with her mother and daughter, familiar, but cramped now, a space too full of memories and not enough room to breathe. Her mother's condition had stabilized, and Lily had kept the house in order as best she could. There were dishes to wash, bills to review, and a stack of unopened mail waiting on the kitchen table. Life moved on. It always did. Eleanor didn't go back to her old job. Even if they offered it, she couldn't walk into that building without feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Instead, she found a small bookstore 3 blocks from home, owned by an older woman named Janice who loved poetry and hated computers. Janice offered Eleanor part-time hours and paid in checks handwritten with a flourish. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for now, enough was everything. Eleanor spent her mornings shelving books, making coffee in a battered French press, and chatting with the older customers who came in looking for mystery novels and second chances. Each evening, she walked home past windows glowing with warm light. Sometimes she looked in, wondering what stories were unfolding behind the curtains. Sometimes, she thought about the sketch she had left behind. One night, as she locked the door to the bookstore and turned her collar up against the breeze, she whispered to herself, "Some lights are worth returning for," and she wondered, quietly, if maybe, just maybe, one day soon, she'd go back, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Sometimes, the loudest things in life are the ones we never say. When Eleanor walked away from the cabin, she thought silence would make things easier. No goodbyes, no explanations, just clean space. But the thing about silence, it doesn't always stay quiet. Sometimes it echoes. Grayson didn't call, didn't write, didn't send flowers or apologies or dramatic gestures. What he did do, the morning after Eleanor left, was pick up the drawing she had left behind, the sketch of the kitchen in firelight. With her soft handwriting in the corner, "Some lights are worth returning for." He stared at it for a long time, not because he was trying to read into it, but because it felt like she had left a part of herself behind. A memory, maybe, a question, a door that hadn't fully closed. He didn't put the drawing away. He framed it, had it matted with linen, and set it on the mantel, just above the fireplace where they had once sat in silence, both unsure how to name what was growing between them. The cabin stayed the same, books on the shelves, coffee in the tin, but everything was quieter. And yet, he didn't fill the silence. He let it settle. Because sometimes, the waiting is the message. In Charleston, Eleanor's days began to resemble peace. She returned to the small house she shared with her mother and daughter. Each morning, she helped her mother into the day, adjusting pillows, sorting medicine, preparing toast with just the right amount of butter. There was a rhythm to caregiving, a quiet love in small, repetitive tasks. At the bookstore, she shelved paperbacks, recommended titles, and made coffee for the customers who came not just for books, but for company. There was something soft about the space sunlight filtering through dusty windows, the scent of aging paper, the soft clink of teacups in the back room. Some days, Eleanor felt almost content, like maybe this was what healing looked like: simple days, steady work, the comfort of knowing where she belonged. But even in the calm, there was a sense of something missing. It wasn't dramatic, just a space in her chest that hadn't quite filled back in. She noticed it when she made dinner and set only 2 plates, when she sketched in her notebook and caught herself glancing toward the empty chair, when she walked home under golden streetlights and remembered how still the trees had been up in the mountains. Then came the letter, but before the letter came the news. It arrived on a Wednesday. Anna, her daughter, burst into the bookstore after school, waving a cream-colored envelope in her hand. "I got it. Mom," she shouted, "the scholarship, full ride." All 4 years, Eleanor stood frozen for a second, heart stunned by the weight of joy. Then she wrapped her daughter in the kind of hug that doesn't let go easily. Tears ran down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from a depth of love and relief that felt almost holy. Her mother cried too, from the front porch, waving the acceptance letter like a prayer answered. That night, Eleanor sat alone on the couch. The house was quiet. Anna had gone to bed early, exhausted from celebration. Her mother dozed in her chair. Eleanor held the letter in her lap and cried again, this time for a different reason. Because joy has its own kind of silence, and in that silence, she missed him. Not for what he had given her, but for how he had seen her, for how he had listened without rushing, for the way he made stillness feel full, not empty. A few days later, as she was closing the shop, Eleanor found a small package wrapped in brown paper behind the counter. No return address, just her name. The handwriting was unmistakable. She carried it home, fingers trembling slightly, waited until the house was quiet again, then sat at the kitchen table and unwrapped it carefully, as if something fragile might break. Inside was a wooden frame. Her drawing, the same one she had left on the coffee table at the cabin. Only now it was matted with soft linen, preserved behind glass. Every line just as she had drawn it: the candle on the table, the mugs in the sink, the firelight curling into shadows. She touched the edge of the frame with trembling fingers. Behind it was a folded piece of paper. She hesitated before opening it. The paper was thick, the ink a deep blue. The letter was short, no declarations, no pleading, just this: "You didn't owe me anything. You still don't. But the days have been colder since you left. You made my world warmer. Come back if you want to stay warm too." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. Her hands fell into her lap. She stared out the kitchen window, the frame in front of her, the letter still trembling in her hands. She didn't cry, didn't smile, just sat there in the quiet, feeling something shift inside her. It wasn't resolution, not yet, but it was no longer emptiness either. That night, she placed the framed sketch on her nightstand, next to a lamp she rarely used, and a photograph of Anna at age 6 wearing a crooked tiara made of tinfoil. She brushed her fingers over the glass one more time, whispered softly into the dark, "I hear you." Then she turned out the light. Not every home has a roof. Some are made of glances, shared silences, and cups of morning coffee. Eleanor didn't tell anyone she was going. Not her daughter, not her mother, not even herself. Really? She just woke up one morning before the sun rose, packed a small bag, and got in the car. The drive to the mountains was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, just full of breath you haven't taken yet. She watched the trees blur past, early spring branches bare but hopeful. The road curved like it remembered her. She didn't know if he would be there, didn't know if the cabin would still feel the same. She only knew that something in her chest had stopped waiting and started moving. When she turned the final bend, she saw him. Grayson was outside, shoveling snow from the front steps. A knit beanie covered his hair, and his breath came in slow clouds against the morning air. He hadn't changed much, still quiet, still measured, but something in his posture slightly straighter, like he'd been holding space for something, made her heart ache. He looked up and saw her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind whispered through the trees. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she stepped out of the car. Still, no words. But then, he set the shovel down, slowly, walked toward her, and she walked too. They met halfway, not with explanations, not with questions, just an embrace, long, unhurried, silent. His arms wrapped around her as if he didn't need to ask why she'd come, and hers held him like she never wanted to explain again. She didn't say, "I'm back." He didn't say, "You're home." They just stood in the middle of the snow, wrapped in a moment that said more than words ever could. Inside the cabin, not much had changed. The framed sketch still sat above the fireplace. The books remained exactly where she had last touched them. Even the cup she once drank from was in its usual place on the shelf, as if it had been waiting. Grayson made coffee. Eleanor unpacked her bag. There were no conversations about where she would sleep, no talk of arrangements or boundaries. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, eating soup and tearing bread into pieces with their hands. It was quiet, but it wasn't silence. It was something softer, something earned. Over the next few days, they moved around each other gently, like two people relearning a dance they had once improvised and now chose to practice with care. Eleanor swept the porch in the mornings. Grayson repaired the garden fence out back. They didn't fill every minute with purpose. Sometimes, they just sat. He read, she drew, and between them lay a kind of stillness that didn't demand anything. Only allowed, there were no contracts, no agreements, just presence, and that, more than anything else, felt sacred. One afternoon, after a walk through the woods, Grayson led her to a small room off the back hallway she had never noticed before. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside was a sunlit space with large windows facing the trees. A sturdy wooden table stood beneath the window. Beside it, an old easel, covered with a white cloth. The air smelled faintly of cedar and turpentine. Eleanor stepped in, her hand instinctively brushing the edge of the table. It was worn smooth, but solid. On the shelf sat a box of paints. Grayson moved beside her, lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of oil's soft hues, delicate shades, and beside them, a palette, faded, but still marked with fingerprints of color. She used to paint here, he said quietly. My mother. This was her space. Eleanor turned to him, uncertain. This feels like a beginning. He finished for her. Not an obligation, just a gift. If you want it, her throat tightened. I haven't painted in nearly 20 years, she whispered. I know, he said, but I've seen the way your fingers twitch when you look at the trees, and the way you watch light fall across the floor. She laughed softly. You watch me more than I realized. I listen, even when you're silent. She stepped forward and touched the palette. It was smooth, the wood still holding the warmth of time, and just like that, something inside her began to open, not all at once, not loudly, but like the slow unfurling of a leaf reaching for spring. That evening, Eleanor didn't pick up her sketchbook. She chose a canvas. She laid out the paints one by one, chose a brush, and dipped it into the soft amber hue of late afternoon light. She didn't think about making something perfect. She didn't think about making something at all. She just began. Her hand moved slowly, unsure but honest, and with each stroke, a little more of her returned. Not the woman who had been left behind in Charleston, not the one who had once traded herself for a night, but the woman who had lived, learned, grieved, and chosen her way back by heart, not by map. Grayson watched from the doorway. He didn't interrupt, didn't comment. He simply leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes quiet, and smiled. He once made business deals worth millions with just a handshake. But this time, he was shaking. It was late afternoon, and the lake behind the cabin shimmered in quiet silver. The air had that early autumn crispness, cool enough for long sleeves, warm enough for bare hands. Grayson had spent the whole morning rehearsing in his head. Not speeches, not promises, not arguments, just possibilities. And yet, now, standing beside the water with Eleanor by his side, every word felt too small. She was sketching the edge of the dock, bare feet resting on a sun-warmed stone. Wind tugged gently at her hair, and a soft crease of focus marked her brow. He almost didn't say anything. Almost. But then she looked at him, and smiled not out of politeness or habit, but with the kind of smile that comes from being seen, and still loved. And he knew. Now or never. "I want to ask you something," he said, voice quieter than he meant it to be. Eleanor blinked, looked up from her sketch pad. "Everything okay?" He nodded, then pulled something from his pocket, a small box, worn at the corners. The velvet faded but soft. Her breath caught. "I never thought I'd want this," he began. "I've had this ring for years. It belonged to my mother. I kept it in a drawer, far back, behind old receipts and things I didn't want to deal with. I told myself I didn't believe in marriage, that it was too messy, too uncertain." He paused, swallowed. "But then you came into my life like a quiet breath I didn't know I'd been holding, and somehow everything that felt complicated started making sense." He opened the box. Inside was a delicate ringgold band, one small sapphire in the center, flanked by two tiny diamonds, not flashy, not modern, but timeless. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I'm not asking you out of guilt," he said, "or because of what we've been through. I'm asking because I want to build the quiet kind of life with you, the one with mismatched mugs and shared grocery lists and soft mornings." She didn't cry. She just looked at him with that stillness he had come to love. Then she whispered, "Yes." And in that one word was everything, not obligation, not rescue, but love, real, earned, and whole. They didn't plan a grand wedding. There were no invitations with embossed lettering, no banquet hall, no orchestra. Just the back porch, a string of borrowed fairy lights, and the people who mattered. Janice from the bookstore brought scones. The neighbor who helped plow the road each winter arrived with a mason jar of homemade cider. Anna wore a soft blue dress and walked her mother down the short path lined with pine cones and old wooden lanterns. Eleanor wore a cream-colored dress that had belonged to her aunt. Grayson wore his best suit jacket and forgot to brush his hair. It was perfect, not because it was flawless, but because it was full of grace. During the ceremony, they stood under the old oak tree behind the cabin, its branches arched above them like a quiet cathedral. The officiant, a retired teacher from the local town who had once taught Grayson's niece, smiled kindly and invited them to share their vows. Grayson reached into his jacket and unfolded a piece of aged paper. It wasn't a speech, it was a page torn from a book, a copy of The Art of Stillness, the same one Eleanor had once read aloud beside the fireplace. Thinking he was asleep, he cleared his throat and began to sit with another person in silence, is to say, "I see you. I choose you. Not because I must, but because even in the stillness, you make the world feel full." He paused, voice thickening. "With you, Eleanor, I've learned that love doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it listens, and in that listening, it stays." Eleanor touched his hand. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes said everything. After the ceremony, they all shared slices of pie on mismatched plates. Someone brought out a guitar. Anna read a poem she had written. The dog from next door tried to eat a boutonniere and was gently shooed away. When the sun began to set, casting long golden streaks across the mountains, Eleanor and Grayson wandered down to the lake, just the two of them. They sat on the bench he had built the previous summer. Not close together, just close enough. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The water shimmered, catching the last of the day's light. Birdsong echoed from the trees, soft and steady. Eleanor reached for his hand, their fingers threading together like second nature. "I'm still scared," she whispered. "I know," he said. "So am I. But I'm not running." He turned to her, the golden light painting her face in soft tones. "Neither am I." They sat that way for a long time. Two people who had once bartered in survival, now investing in something quieter, something stronger, not promises of forever, but the decision to show up again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because sometimes the real vows are the ones you live, not the ones you say. And that evening, as the sky blushed pink and the world tilted toward night, Eleanor whispered softly, "I think we're going to be okay." Grayson squeezed her hand. "We already are." Her dream didn't die. It just waited for her to come home to it. The studio began as a whisper, a passing idea, mumbled over coffee one chilly morning as Eleanor sat beside the window, watching golden leaves swirl across the porch. "I've been thinking," she said softly, stirring her tea. "Maybe I could teach. Maybe there are women out there who used to draw and forgot how." Grayson didn't interrupt. He just reached for her hand, curled his fingers gently around hers, and said, "Then let's make them remember." 3 months later, the garage beside the cabin had been transformed. The old concrete floor was polished smooth and warm with scattered rugs. The walls were painted a soft eggshell white, catching the morning light just right. An old shelf held boxes of brushes, palettes, folded aprons, jars of water, and soft cloths. There was no formal sign out front, just a wooden board carved with care, hung beside the door, that read, "The Studio of Second Chances." Women began showing up. Quietly, carefully, they were mothers whose children had grown, retirees who once doodled in the margins of grocery lists, widows with long afternoons and quiet hands. One woman brought a cane and a story about the watercolor kit her husband gave her in 1984. Another had never held a paintbrush, but said, "I figured it's never too late to try." Eleanor welcomed them all with tea and patience. There were no grades, no critiques, only space to try, to fail, to laugh, to start over. She taught them how to mix color like memory, how shadows aren't just black, they're purple, blue, soft brown, how to breathe when a line doesn't go where you want it to. And slowly, week by week, the studio filled with something more than art. It filled with warmth, with second beginnings, with women remembering who they were before life got loud. Grayson watched it all unfold from a quiet distance. He still handled business, but something had shifted. Instead of mergers and negotiations, he started investing in things closer to home, a community garden, a literacy program for single mothers, a scholarship fund for local kids who never saw college as an option. He said less in meetings now, listen more, smile more, too. "One day," he told Eleanor, "it took me half a lifetime to realize. Meaning doesn't come from how much you earn, it comes from who you show up for." She looked at him for a long time after that, then kissed his hand. They didn't speak for the rest of the evening. They didn't need to. Their life was simple. Mornings with toast and shared sections of the newspaper. Afternoons where Eleanor taught while Grayson chopped wood or read on the porch. Evenings spent side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes drawing, sometimes just being. They didn't chase excitement. They grew roots, and in those roots, they found peace. One afternoon, while the studio was empty and the light spilled golden across the table, Eleanor began a new canvas. She worked slowly, carefully, layer by layer, shape by shape. It took weeks. Sometimes she painted only for 10 minutes, sometimes for hours, forgetting to eat. Grayson noticed, of course, but didn't ask. He simply kept the fire going, made her tea, and left clean brushes by her side. The painting was finished on a quiet Sunday. Eleanor stood before it, breath held. It was a portrait subtle, soft, full of quiet meaning. Grayson stood on the left, in a flannel shirt, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on the shoulder of Anna, her daughter who smiled softly at something just outside the frame. Behind them, the cabin, a hint of the lake, and the first blush of autumn trees. Eleanor titled it Unexpected Forever. She didn't tell him about it right away. Instead, she submitted it anonymously to a local art event held at the library. Just a small-town thing, folding chairs, lemonade and paper cups, neighbors and cardigans. She didn't expect much, just a chance to let it breathe. The evening of the event, they arrived just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the gallery windows. Eleanor kept her distance, pretended to admire landscapes, chatted with women from her class. Grayson wandered, then he saw it, tucked into the back corner, modestly lit, framed in soft wood. He stopped. Eleanor watched from across the room as he stepped closer. He read the plaque. He tilted his head, and then he reached out, slowly, and touched the edge of the frame. His shoulders shifted, his breath hitched, and then the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, just a single line tracing down his cheek. He turned slowly and met her eyes across the room, and that one look full of wonder, of gratitude, of love deeper than words was more than any applause she would ever need. That night, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "She's always been yours, you know," she said softly. Grayson shook his head. "She's always been ours." And in that moment, with the fire popping gently and the stars pressing close to the windows, Eleanor knew this wasn't just a second chance at love. It was a second chance at living fully, at showing up, at being seen, at giving light without needing permission to shine. She offered herself for one night to pay her debt, but what she found was forever. 5 years had passed, not in a rush, not in a blur, but in the slow, steady rhythm of a life well lived. The cabin, once quiet and uncertain, had become home. The porch steps creaked in the same places. The kettle still whistled every morning at 7:12. Grayson's boots still sat by the door, next to Eleanor's paint-stained sneakers. Time had softened them both. Grayson's hair had more gray now. Eleanor's laugh lines had deepened. But if you asked either of them, they'd say it wasn't aging. It was settling, like roots finally growing deep enough to hold. Anna came home for Thanksgiving every year. She brought stories of late-night studying and early morning coffees, of roommates, internships, and growing independence. But each visit, no matter how brief, always ended with her tucked beside Eleanor on the couch, her head on her mother's shoulder, whispering, "It still feels like home." Eleanor would smile and say, "That's because it is." The studio had grown, not into a franchise, not into a business empire, but into something better, a community. Women kept coming older, younger, new, returning. They brought their grief, their laughter, their quiet longings, and Eleanor welcomed them with open hands and open space. No one left without having created something, even if it was just a line on a page, or a story they hadn't spoken aloud before. Janice retired and came to paint every Thursday. Caleb, the old neighbor who once helped repair the fence, now stopped by to deliver wildflowers to the ladies with stories in their eyes. And every so often, Grayson would sneak in during class and leave muffins on the table. No one said anything, but everyone smiled. One Saturday afternoon in early spring, Eleanor stood before her class, 6 women seated around the table, the sun pouring in, warm and generous. They were working with charcoal that day, trying to capture the soft folds of an old quilt someone had brought in. The studio smelled of lavender and pencil dust. As one student paused and sighed, "I'm making a mess." Eleanor set her own charcoal down and said quietly, "You know, I once made a bigger mess than this." They all looked up. Her smile was gentle, but steady. "There was a time, long ago, when I thought I'd lost everything, my job, my reputation, my dignity." She paused, choosing her words not for drama, but for truth. "I was offered help, but it came with a cost, a night, just one. I said yes because I didn't see another way out." The room was silent, but not uncomfortable. "It wasn't the smartest decision I ever made," she said, "but it was the bravest, because it led me to a life I never expected. a love I didn't think I deserved, and a version of myself I thought I'd lost. She turned to the sketch pad beside her, flipping to a page a simple charcoal drawing of two hands. Fingers intertwined, one of the women whispered. "Is that?" Eleanor nodded. "It's us. Me and him, years ago, before the vows, before the rings, when all we had was uncertainty and choice." A pause. Then she said, "Forever wasn't what I planned, but it was the best bargain I ever made." That evening, after the class had gone and the brushes had been washed, Eleanor stood at the back porch with Grayson. The mountains stretched before them, a quiet hymn of light and distance. The wind carried the smell of rain and pine. Inside, a casserole bubbled in the oven. The table was set for two. Eleanor leaned into him. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" He chuckled softly. "You mean when I acted like a complete idiot with too much money and not enough heart?" She smiled. "Something like that." He turned to her, more serious now. "I think about it every day. Not because I regret it, but because it reminds me how easily we could have missed this." She nodded. "I almost walked away forever. But you didn't." "No," she said, "because somewhere between the silence and the snowfall, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning." He kissed her forehead, not as punctuation, but as ritual. They ate dinner by candlelight, not because the power was out, but because it felt right. They talked about ordinary things, laundry, weather, a new student who kept mixing up her reds and greens. And when the dishes were done and the fire burned low, they sat on the couch, hand in hand. Nothing between them but time, not borrowed, not promised, just theirs. Later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she paused by the studio door. She stepped inside, barefoot on the cool wood floor. On the wall hung her favorite painting, Unexpected Forever. Beside it, a small frame held a note from Anna, written last Christmas. "Thank you for showing me that second chances aren't just possible, they're beautiful." She traced the words with her finger, then turned off the light. In the dark, she climbed into bed beside Grayson. He was already half asleep, breathing slow and steady. She lay beside him, watching the shadows on the ceiling, and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." He didn't respond, but his hand found hers under the blanket, warm and certain, and that was answer enough. Sometimes, life leads us to choices we never imagined making. We may feel ashamed, desperate, or alone in those moments, but Eleanor's story reminds us of something powerful. Our worth is never defined by a single decision, especially the ones made in survival. In a world that often values perfection, this story gently tells us that healing takes time, that love can be quiet, and that second chances are not just possible, they are beautiful. It's about how trust can grow from broken places, and how ordinary days morning, coffee, folding laundry, holding hands can become the most extraordinary kind of forever. For those who have loved later in life, made mistakes, or felt like they missed their moment, this story is a soft hand on your shoulder. It whispers, it's never too late. You're never too far gone. And sometimes, the life you didn't plan becomes the one that saves you. So, be kind to your past, welcome your present, and don't be afraid to start again, no matter how old you are. Because love, peace, and purpose are not reserved for the young. They're waiting for anyone brave enough to believe again. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone you care about, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more healing, hope-filled stories to life. From our hearts to yours, thank you. Truly,